After playing TFT for 16 sets, I'm going to give you 67 tips to help you climb in the new set, ranging from set-specific tips about unlockables, general, beginner, intermediate, and advanced tips, along with traits, augment, portal, and champion tips. Regardless of your player level, I guarantee you that there will be tips here that you did not actually know. Feel free to skip around, depending on what section you want to focus on the most. There will be chapters that you can navigate below. But let's get right into the beginner tips. Let's start off with unlockables, which is a set mechanic. So obviously, you unlock champions and they show up in your next shop after you unlock them, but here's some quick little tips to help you push this even further. The first one is, if you unlock a champion and do not want it, simply don't buy it. Obviously, we should avoid unlocking stuff that we don't want, but sometimes you do it by accident, or sometimes it's just how the game played out, or maybe you're pivoting. The way to increase the odds that you'll get stuff that you want is to make the unlocked champion that you do not want to appear less often. And the way to do that is by making sure they are not on your bench or board. When that happens, the game's internal coding makes them appear less often. Next, after you get 3 copies of an unlocked champion, such as a 2-star Volibear, it is more difficult to find additional copies than usual in order to compensate for unit pool sizes. The more people unlock a champion though, the easier it is to see them. So in case you didn't know, TFT is kind of like a card game. There's a shared champion pool amongst all the players in the entire game. However, with unlocks, obviously someone's not going to unlock the same champion you are that often, right? So in order to balance that, they're making it artificially more difficult to get additional copies after the first 3. So 3-starring Volibear, gonna be very difficult, or like a 4 cost. The next tip is around the strength of unlockable champions. So not all unlockable champions are automatically stronger than regular champions. So it's like a 4 cost Garen, is he worse than like a 4 cost unlockable tank? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Pretty much the more difficult it is to unlock a champion, the stronger they are. For example, if you're just playing a trait and the champion unlock condition is like, oh, just play 5 of these trait champions, that unlockable probably isn't going to be that strong. However, if you look at something like Sylas, who has an enormous unlock condition, which includes selling a Jarvan, Lux, and Garen 2-star, doing something like that is crazy. So in order to compensate, Riot has to buff up Sylas's strength by a ton, which they did, so he's going to be much more powerful than the other big champions in the game. The last trait tip I have is that some units require certain items on other units to get unlocked, so keep in mind these do not need to be on player versus player rounds. Read whatever it says so that you know whether you need to do that or not, but doing it 1 turn early can definitely help save a lot of life, especially if it's one of the bigger requirements, such as Gargoyle Stone Plate on Skarner. So you can, again, do it on the neutral rounds. In this example here, I want to play 3 Bilgewater, and I only have 2 of them. So I'm going to put 2 items onto my Twisted Fate right before the round ends. That way I get Graves in my next shop, and then I'll be able to play 3 Bilgewater. But knowing which ones require combat and which ones don't can potentially save you a lot of life. Now let's move on into 6 beginner tips. Off topic, I have 7 intermediate, but like, I promise you, I did not do that on purpose. But the first tip for beginners is to read, and also read. As a kid, I wanted to be a lawyer. I was doing like LSAT logic puzzles for fun at the age of 12, but after my sister became one, I didn't want to do it anymore because I learned that you have to read a lot if you want to become a lawyer, and I honestly hate reading. And unfortunately, that has transferred over onto TFT in a game where you need to read a lot. If you want to get good, you have to read what the champions are, what augments do, what traits do, what unlocks do, abilities, literally everything. Because there are a lot of hidden mechanics that aren't really so hidden because they're out in plain sight. One of them being that unlockable requirement being in combat versus out of combat. Knowing a lot of these little things will make you a better player without even having to play the game. And it also helps you avoid looking stupid if you're making TFT videos. My next beginner tip is about leveling. So leveling thresholds have changed this set in case you are new or haven't played yet. I made a leveling guide that you can refer to, but if it's too long, didn't watch, well, I'd have to say you at least owe me a sub for that because you didn't watch. But the summary is that level 8 is now 12 gold more expensive. That means when you're fast 8ing in previous sets, you'll have like 40 gold to roll down with. Now you'll have 28. If you had 50 gold to roll down with, now you'll have 38. This means you need to have much higher econ this game, both to reach level 8 and to roll down with. So econ augments have become a little bit more important this set. I mean, they always were important, but it's even more important this set. And don't keep the habit of thinking leveling up is 48 gold, because it's 60 now. However, econ isn't like super duper duper OP. because to compensate for this, 4 cost odds are a little bit higher on level 8, so you don't need to roll as much as you did before, but obviously you still need a bunch of gold. They also made levels 9 and 10 less because of level 8 being higher. So after you reach level 8, you're more likely to go level 9 and possibly even 10, whereas before, you pretty much never went 10. Now let's talk about items. One common tip in TFT is to always slam items in order to get value from them. However, how many should you slam? Well, my rule of thumb is never have more than 4 item components on your bench, because each round that passes by where you do not have an item built is value lost forever. It's like being a landlord and having a vacancy. Once the time passes, you can't get it back. I know that was like a super relatable analogy, but pretty much until you're diamond, if you have 4 or more item components on your bench, build something. Like, I don't care what it is, drop down to 2 unbuilt components, right? Because chances are you are missing out on a ton of value by greeting for best in slots when you really shouldn't be. I'd say do this until you get to diamond, and at that point you could try doing more niche strategies and maybe breaking this rule and going to maybe 4 or 5 unbuilt components if you're doing like very specific strategies where it may be optimal not to build items. It's rare, but it does happen. My next beginner item tip is 3 items equals 3 items. You may hear this term often because it kind of became like a meme in the TFT community, but TFT is a game about power concentration. Stacking 1 carry and 1 tank is generally the optimal way to play. So if you have an item to build, try to build it on a champion that is already holding some items, and try to get it up to 3 as quickly as possible, and then work on the next one and the next one and the next one. Obviously, you do have to do a balancing act between building some defense and offense, because that's what you need in your team comp. But if you were itemizing a tank, an AD, and AP carry all at once, it's much better to focus on an AD and tank or an AP and tank rather than splitting the DPS items throughout the course of the game. Next, let's talk about your team comp. You should always be using your team planner because it's a very easy way to know what units you're gonna buy, know what units you could potentially buy to pivot into something else with, and also just a way to just plan in advance. It makes rolling down easier because the units get highlighted in your shop, and you could also check out their unlock conditions in advance. There's really no reason not to use a team planner. You might think it's like a noob tool, but it really isn't. I've seen world champions use a team planner, and yeah, pretty much everyone uses it. My last beginner tip also deals with team comps, and it is that every team comp requires the same things. Obviously, damage dealers and tanks are 2 of the most important things to have, but in terms of utility effects, almost every team needs a source of anti-heal, shred, or sunder depending on your damage. So make sure you build a Sunfire, Red Buff, or Morello for burn effects in every single team, and also get an Even Shroud or Last Whisper for attack damage teams, and Ionic and Void Staff for AP teams. There are different ways to get these effects, but pretty much every comp needs them, but you don't always have to do it through items. For example, units or traits sometimes give these effects. For example, Aphelios gives Sunder, he's a Targon, and Zoe, another Targon, gives Shred. I don't care what you do, but just make sure you have some source of Shred and anti-heal somewhere in your team. If not, you're going to get outscaled in the late game. Now let's talk about traits. So we just talked about the team planner. One great use of the team planner is to check the Ionia trait bonus at the start of every game. The reason why you want to do this is because you need to know whether Ionia is worth going or not that game. There are going to be some patches where one version of Ionia is going to be more OP than the others. There are going to be other ones where like, oh, your specific items work out really well for that one, or like one specific champion that you have really works out as like a reroll comp for a specific Ionia trait. That's what you need to know. Just check it. It takes like 2 seconds every single game. Next, we have a Shurima tip. So Shurima is a really fun trait, but when should you go for this? Because you need Azir early, and you also need to complete 3 different quests to get to 4 Shurima. It's an extremely risky strategy to actually go for 4 Shurima, so I don't actually recommend doing this unless you have the perfect setup for it. Obviously, you can go for 2 or 3 Shurima, no problem, but going for 4 requires a lot. So you essentially cannot guarantee hitting every single quest, so only go for 4 Shurima if you can afford to take a risk that game, or if you need to take that risk to stay in the game. So if you're super high rolling and you already won the game, like you don't need to go for 4 Shurima because you're already gonna win the game, right? But if you're maybe in a game where like, oh, maybe I go 6, but if I get the streak of getting 2 more Shurima units, I have a chance to get the 4th one, then obviously you should go for it, because if not, you risk getting a 6. But essentially, you need a lot of HP to get to 4 Shurima because you have to end up losing a lot of games, and you also have to plan out which ones you're going to do in which order, because One of them requires lose streaking, one of them requires win streaking, and another one requires win-lose, win-lose. But every time you unlock a Shurima, unlocking the other ones requires more games, so you have to be careful not to take too many losses or need too many wins. Next up we have is Freljord. So I've made this mistake in the past. You're trying to go 7 Freljord because going deep into a trait, very nice stuff. But in order to do that, you need to get Volibear. And Volibear is mandatory in 7 Freljord. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. However, you need to unlock him. So the other unlock for Freljord is Tryndamere. Tryndamere is pretty easy because you just need to put 2 items on Ash. But Volibear needs you to have a unit with 3,800 or more health. They might change this number, but that's what you need right now. And in order to get that, you need either a Warmogs or something like 4 Bruiser with random tank items in order to get it unlocked. This means you need to plan out your items in the early game. If you have a belt, don't build like a Guard Breaker or Stride Breaker early game because you probably need that belt for the Warmogs in order to unlock your Volibear. Build in something like a Morello, another dangerous thing to do because again, you might need that belt for later. So if you are playing Freljord, promise me you'll try to make sure you have some route to unlock Volibear. It could be doing something like 4 Bruiser and then building like a Sunfire. I'm not saying you always need Warmogs, but it's much easier if you just have one because you'll pretty much guarantee get it. Next, let's talk about Void. Void is really fun because you get a bunch of different upgrades and you can potentially get Baron Nashor, who's absolutely bonkers busted. The upgrades are what you're going to be playing around with early on in the game. So all you have to do is drag and drop from your item bench over onto the unit that you want the Void upgrade on, and then they get a nice little buff. And these buffs are different every single game, or the order is different. So it's a good idea to check which ones you have. You can do this while you're checking for Ionia, just to see what you might want to play around. But another thing to know is that you are not married to your Void upgrade because you could put it on a unit and always move it to someone else later. So you don't have to lock it into one unit forever like you do with items where you need to use an item remover to get it off of them. In order to reuse your Void upgrades or to replace them, simply just bench the unit that has the upgrade and then put them back on the board. That'll give you the upgrade back into your item bench, and then you could put it on whoever you want right after that. Now let's talk about Invokers. So Invokers are not a reprint of old Invokers, even though they have the same name. And usually Invoker type of traits, last year I think it was like Scholar Yumi or something like that, I forget the exact name of it. All these mana traits usually don't like having mana items on the mana carries. The reason why is because you don't want to overbuild one stat because it's better to split up your stats into all different categories. So if you have a lot of mana, you want like AP and crit. And Invokers used to work that way. However, since this is not a reprint, it's working differently this time. This time, Invokers increase the mana that you get from mana regeneration. So what that means is that you actually want mana items on your Invokers to make use of the trait. Obviously, if you're an AP damage dealer, AP is still nice, but for the most part, build in something like a blue buff or adaptive helm is probably going to be better for most Invokers. Next, let's talk Targons. Targons are traitless, or like they're a fake trait. They're kind of like threats in previous sets, so they're extra strong. But all of them have like a nice little unique effect. So if you ever don't know what to run in the mid game and you just need to run something temporary, always consider running a Targon unit, especially if they have an effect that you need. So if you're dealing a lot of physical damage, Aphelios gives Sunder, which is armor penetration, Zoe gives Shred and Chill, Leona gives a burn effect, and then Taric gives magic resistance to the rest of your team. So each of the Targons that are unlocked already all have a nice little effect that you can kind of tech in and out. And even in the late game, like if you're in a 1v1 scenario against a magic damage dealer, like playing a Taric, probably not a bad idea, especially if he's 2-starred. The next tip is a hilarious tip about Bilgewater. So I know a lot of people, when they play these like traits with a shop that opens up after a while, the game does it automatically for you. So the first time I've seen some people play Bilgewater, they didn't even know where the shop was. You have to actually like click it to open it. It doesn't pop up automatically. I know this sounds kind of silly, but you have to make sure you actually use the shop. If not, you're not using the trait at all. And it doesn't pop up automatically. Next up is Ixtal. So the point of Ixtal is to do a lot of quests and eventually unlock Brock, who is an absolute monster. But to unlock Brock, you need 500 Sun Shards. Fun fact though, you don't need to spend them all at once to unlock Brock. You could spend them over the course of the game and it just needs to add up to 500. Nice little trick there, because some games you might need to spend it early instead of saving it to spend all at once. By the way, this fun little tip is already on my meta snapshot at bunnymuffins.lol/meta, so do check that out if you have not already for the latest and greatest team comps to play in order to climb as quickly as possible. Next up we have is Piltover. I know we talked about Void and Ionia before, how you can kind of check what you get from the trait, but Piltover is a little bit different but also similar in the same way. So Piltover allows you to unlock an effect every time you play a new threshold of them. However, you could always splash 2 Piltover into your team comp if your team allows it. For example, Vi is Piltover, but she also has 2 other traits, so she can easily be splashed in with a bunch of different people. Sometimes if you play 2 Piltover, you could get like the exact effect that you need, and if that is the case, it could be very powerful. If not, you could always check what your 2 Piltover setup is by activating it, and then if it sucks, you could just never play it again. But it's important to check to try to min-max your game in some cases, because if the effect truly is exactly what you need, then if you don't check, you'll never know. What do they say? You miss 100% of the Piltovers you don't check or something? Speaking of missing, Yordles are a little goofy this set. So I think they're like 10 Yordles, and they have a lot of 1, 2, and 3 costs. They might look like a reroll trait, but they're actually not. Like, you still can reroll them. I'm not saying it's impossible, but they actually have great value as a fast 8 comp as well, because when you get 8 Yordles out, you get grab bags each round and you get a bunch of loot and rewards. So you can easily get 3-star Yordles of the low cost even though you're level 8 still. So it kind of is similar to like Crew in that way, where like it's okay to level up. But I just want to make sure everyone knows that like Yordles can be rerolled, but they also can be fast aided. You don't have to lock yourself into one specific playstyle. Next, I want to talk about positioning. One positioning trait that's pretty important to look out for is disruptors. So disruptors can reduce damage of the units that they hit with their abilities. So that sounds pretty good, right? However, you need to make sure it actually hits units that you want to hit. I know a lot of them have big AoEs, like Seraphine casts a bunch, right? Like a bunch of the disruptors, they have like pretty big casts, but you still want to make sure they actually hit your intended target. Because if you just hit a bunch of tanks, that's not going to do anything. So every round, if you're playing disruptors, make sure you're hitting who you want to hit. And also if you're playing against disruptors, there might be a chance to dodge the disruptor spells if your opponents are sleeping. The last trait tip I have for you today is, if you haven't noticed yet, this set is a flex set. Pretty much every class trait that exists, classes meaning slayers, gunslingers, things like that, a lot of these have a team-wide bonus if you simply run 2 of them, which means that you can customize your team a lot by playing a bunch of random units while still buffing up your primary carry. If you're playing Lissandra, you don't have to go like full Freljord every time to play her, because if you're running an AP carry, you can have 2 Arcanists, 2 Invoker to give AP and mana regen team-wide, which obviously helps everyone even though they might not even have that trait. Like Azir would probably love that, but he's neither of those. So make sure you flex this set. And when you do, just know that a lot of these random traits like Bruiser gives a bunch of health to everyone. They're pretty good bonuses to slot in, and you could kind of play anything. Now, after we talked about traits, let's move into the champions. I think we have 23 of them here. So let's start off with the 1 cost. I'm going to move all the way up to 5 costs. So Anivia is actually pretty useless on her own, but if you pair her with chill effects, she becomes really, really good because she's guaranteed to crit if her target is chilled. So make sure you actually take advantage of this. Run like Nico. Nico chills people. A lot of Freljord units chill people. Some like random bullcrap in the game chills people. But just make sure no matter what you're doing, you have some sort of chill effect on your team if you're playing Anivia, especially if she has items, because if not, she's just completely useless. Well, not completely, but not great, you know? Next up we have is Viego. Viego unlocks Shadow Owls, and Shadow Owls is really fun to play, but you might be wondering, when is the latest you can play him? I'd say getting him 2-star around stage 2-3 is kind of like a safe spot. Anything before that is like, obviously you can go Shadow Owl. Anything after that, it's a bit more questionable. But I'd say at 2-3, that's kind of like the place where it's like, okay, yeah, this is still a good place to play him. But you need Viego 2-star early in order to unlock future Shadow Owl units in a timely manner. And if their numbers change to unlock them, I'll let you know, and I'll update this at my tier list, bunnymuffins.lol/meta, in the Shadow Owl section. But for now, I'd say around 2-3 is a pretty good spot. Obviously, 2-1 is best, but not everyone was born on third base, you know? And obviously, you probably should have some item on him if you plan on playing Shadow Owl, because he is going to be one of the carries early on and help you a lot with your early and mid game. Next up, we have Scion, the 2 cost. So Scion is a stacking unit, which means if you are trying to win streak, do not ever play Scion. You need to actually play him for a few rounds before he gets any bits regular, and then even more rounds before he gets powerful. So unless you have to go Noxus or Bruisers, like, don't play Scion if you're trying to win streak. He also stacks faster the higher his star level is, so getting him to 3-star ASAP is really good if you are using him as your primary tank. So what that means is that if you are slow rolling for him, like level 6, 2-cost reroll, yeah, follow the 2-cost reroll pattern, but do your all-in for Scion a little bit earlier than you normally would. Next up we have is Vi. So quick note about Vi, she's listed as a defender, but she's actually like a fighter or damage dealer. So even though she's all defense in her classes, she's actually someone who's supposed to deal damage, even though she can tank a little bit, but don't use her as your main tank for that reason. Next up we have is Bard. So to unlock Bard, you need to roll 4 times before the first carousel. The best time to do this is on stage 2-3. The reason why is because oftentimes when you play Bard, you're doing a 2-cost reroll, and it's easier to find other 2 costs to reroll with on stage 2-3 because you naturally leveled up to level 4 already. Another fun tip about Bard is that free rerolls also count to unlock Bard. So that could be something like Trade Sector, Prismatic Ticket, anything like that, Epoch. All of that can help you unlock Bard for much cheaper. Next up we have is Jinx. Jinx is a super carry and is pretty useless to your team when not itemized, so make sure you either play her with 3 items or don't play her at all, because she is pretty horrible unless she's actually played around. Speaking of Jinx, she is related to Warwick and Vi, so if you have Jinx and Vi, you unlock Warwick. So if you decide to play the family comp, you must know that they all get stronger when they get takedowns, and obviously you'd know that because you read their abilities, but sometimes reading is not enough. You have to actually know what to do with that information and apply it. So in order to maximize this bonus, make sure you actually focus fire targets in order to get their effect to trigger more often. That often means putting all your damage dealers on the same side, focusing on their weak units. If you scout, like if they have their strongest tank on the right side and their weaker tanks on the left side, move all your team to your left side so that you could quickly kill the weaker units to get the takedown bonus earlier. Another arcane champ is Singed. Singed is pretty fun to play, but make sure you actually don't go for Singed if you're win streaking too hard, because the way to unlock him is that you must lose 35 health. And if you don't do that, you could be in pretty awkward scenarios if you reach level 8 before you actually can unlock Singe. Usually he's just going to be played as like a lose streak stabilization comp, but we'll have to see how that changes in the future based on different patches. Next up we have is the Shurima champions, Nasus and Renekton. So Mortdog said that even though they are 4-cost units, they actually have the power of 5-cost units. So if you get them, pretty much play them no matter what, because they just are going to be that strong. And especially if you 2-star them, like use them as your carries, do everything in your power to buff them up, because they actually are like 5-cost units, but they only cost 4 and they have the unit odds of 4 costs. Now for real 4 costs, let's talk about Fizz. Fizz is the only assassin of the set. Well, not only, but he's like one of the primary ones. So in order to not get screwed over by Fizz, you need to aggressively position around him to avoid him assassinating your backline. So you need to scout, check for Fizz players, and if there is one, try to go on the other side of them. Alternatively, if you want to like super counter Fizz, you could build some survivability items on your backliners, such as like Edge of Night, for example. Although I don't recommend this unless you're in a 1v1 scenario, because it probably is going to be worse than other items in other matchups. But now let's talk about one of the most fun champions in the game, Veigar. I like Veigar so much because you need to have 2 hats to unlock him, and like I mean I only have 1 head, right? So where am I gonna put the other cap? But you might be asking, should you put both Rabadons on the Veigar? He does get more AP than other people. Even despite that, I think just putting 1 hat on Veigar is the best thing to do, and use your second hat for someone else, because the other 2 slots are best used to have something like a jeweled gauntlet or a mana item in order to get him at his max potential. But definitely 1 hat is very good on Veigar, but 2 might be a little much. So we talked about a bunch of damage dealers at 4 cost. Let's talk about Wukong, who's a tank. So obviously for every tank you want to put them in the front row, but does Wukong need something a little different? The answer is yes, because he has an on-death effect. So you want him to die as early as possible to get the most use out of his on-death effect. I'm not saying you want him to commit Sudoku or anything like that, but he probably should be your tank that dies first, because he has a passive that summons a second copy of Wukong. If he's your last tank to die, then you might not get as much of an effect from him. But if he's the first one to die, you do get a bit more value from him, because then your other units can have more time to get their effects off. For example, if you're running Wukong and Swain, if your Swain gets targeted first, he might not be able to cast. But if you get your Wukong to tank first, then his clone comes out, maybe your Swain casts 2 times, who knows. But it's always best to have more units on the board, and having Wukong die first is a way to ensure that. Now let's talk about the 5 costs. Let's start off with Tahm Kench. Tahm Kench is so fun to play because he's unlocked by Bilgewater, and you can make him infinitely strong. The key word though is can and infinite, because if anyone has a way to become infinitely strong, there must be a way to balance them, right? And that is to make them a little bit weaker than they should be before they can get to that infinite spot. So with that in mind, I recommend only playing Tahm Kench if you're not broke. Only play him if you have a ton of money, because you need to be feeding him good stuff in order to reach that super late game dream. Obviously, if you're playing Bilgewater, like, you kind of have to keep playing him, but if you're just playing Tahm Kench to play Tahm Kench, only put him on your board if you actually can support him, because if not, it's probably better to play a different legendary. Now let's talk about Mel. If she existed in real life, I'd probably be too broke to date her, but Mel's best item is going to be, take a guess. It's going to be Adaptive Helm. The reason why is because she gains a ton of mana from draining people, so she is literally the best user of Adaptive Helm's mana bonus. You absolutely must play this item when you play her, and there's pretty much no substitute unless they change something about her, so just keep that in mind before you go for her. Like, have a tier, or if you have a Negatron, find a tier and slam that adaptive as soon as possible. Speaking of slamming, Galio, he loves slamming on the ground, but one interesting thing about him is that you don't field Galio on the board, you play him on your bench. Luckily, he still contributes to your Demacia trait, so you might have noticed the prismatic for Demacia is 11 Demacia. You might be wondering, how do I even get there? Well, you have to get some emblems, and then you also need to be level 10, but Galio counts towards the 11 because he stays on your bench. Another big unit is Baron Nashor. Baron Nashor, my tip for him is that he may look like a tank, but he's actually a melee DPS unit. Don't be fooled. Looks can be deceiving. So while you can still give him tank items and probably do just fine, he's best with like the melee fighter items. So stuff like Starex, Bloodthirster, maybe even Infinity Edge or like some sort of damage. Those are actually going to be the most effective builds on Baron Nashor. Next we have is Fiddlesticks. So Fiddlesticks is an absolutely incredible +1 for any team comp because he reduces the enemy unit's resistances by a flat amount. So literally any team can use him. If you see him in your shop, you might see like, oh, he's a Vanquisher. Don't care. Even if you don't have any Vanquishers, he's still fine to run. Next, let's talk about Ornn. Ornn is actually not that strong this set. Alone, that is. He's literally only good with artifacts, but he's extremely good with artifacts. So if you have an artifact item from earlier in the game, you could always just remove it from whoever you had it on before and drop it on Ornn, even if it doesn't make sense on him. Like, if you have Blighting Jewel, I think the best performing user of Blighting Jewel is going to be Ornn. That's how good he is. Okay, maybe that's exaggerating a little bit, but unless you have some like super best in slot user for any artifact item that exists in the game, swap it off that unit and put it on Ornn, because he literally becomes super good with artifacts, but he's pretty bad without them, because every item that's on Ornn, he gets bonus health, but if they're in artifact items, that bonus gets multiplied by 3. So you're essentially putting like a super Warmogs on your Ornn every time you put an artifact item on him, in addition to all the other effects. Speaking of super tanks, if you're facing a super tank that feels unkillable, Zilean is going to be the counter to that. His bomb will eventually always kill its target after a specified amount of time, depending on his star level, so he is great at dealing with super tanks. Now let's talk about Aesol. Aesol is very weak when you first play him, so if you're playing Targon and you're wanting to go vertical Targon, don't expect to just auto win once you get Aesol. You actually need to play him for a couple rounds before he even does anything. The way to get Aesol strong though is by getting him to cast a lot, because the more he casts, the more he stacks. So you need best on slots on him as quickly as possible. And you probably will lose the first few rounds you play him because he really is that weak early on. Next, let's talk about Annie. Annie is incredibly hit or miss. She's essentially like the parlay of TFT. Like, if you get her at 1 star, she's not that great because you also get Tibbers, who's 1 star as well. Like, obviously, if you need the legendary, then yeah, it's still good. But if you ever get Annie 2 star, it's so big because you get Annie 2 and Tibbers 2. So if you ever get a Nico or a champion duplicator, use it on your Annie because you just get 2 stars, 5 costs. Like, come on, man. It can't get better than that. Life doesn't. You just hit the 2-leg parlay. So do everything in your power to get her to 2 star. I don't care if you have to go in debt to do it. I also have a bonus tip for Annie, and that is you don't have to play Tibbers. Obviously, he is good, but you don't have to play him if you don't want to. Now let's talk about Thresh. So Thresh has a similar case as Baron Nashor, where he looks like a tank, he usually is a tank, but this set he's really not. He actually does decent damage, so put melee damage items on him. The one difference is that he's more of an AP user rather than AD. So doing like a Jeweled Gauntlet Hand of Justice build, or like probably even Crown Guard is really good on him too. Last but not least, we have Rise. He is probably the most fun champion in this set. He's absolutely a monster. You need 4 regions activated in your traits to unlock him. But my recommendation for him is that you shouldn't just try to play Rise from the get-go. You shouldn't like wake up that morning and be like, oh, I want to play Rise today. Let me go do that right now and just hard force Rise. That's probably like the worst way to play Rise, because the way they balance Rise is they have to balance him around his best scenario and his worst scenario. And if you just play him without any thought, that's the worst scenario. So what is his best scenario? His best scenario is when you get a lot of emblems that are also regions. For example, Freljord emblem. So pretty much what I'm trying to say is to not have fun, only play Rise if you get a bunch of random emblems that give you region emblems, because that is going to be the state that he's going to be balanced around. If you're just playing him naked or straight up, I'm not saying it's not going to work, but it's definitely not the best way to do it. It also makes it infinitely easier to unlock him, so you get to play him earlier if you do have a bunch of free traits to kind of use to unlock all the regions. Let's take a break from champions though. Let me give you some intermediate tips. So my first tip is do not roll on neutral rounds unless you are very contested. The reason why is, yeah, you could get more interest gold if you wait till the next round, but even if you have like 80 or 100 gold, I still think you should not roll on neutral rounds unless you like absolutely have to. The reason why is because sometimes the units that you want come from an orb, so you could end up hitting what you want already before you start rolling, in which case it could save you potentially a ton of gold. Next, I want to talk about the units in the set. There are a ton of utility units in this set, which is really rare because utility units have kind of been banned from TFT for a while now. I think like since set 3 or something like that. Maybe not that extreme, but they're extremely rare. What are utility units? They're units that aren't going to be your main carry, so you don't have to put items on them and they still do a lot of work, and a lot of those exist. So first off, we have the Targons that we talked about before, all with like random effects that help every single team, but we also have like pure utility units or support units such as Kabuko and Yumi. So Yumi gives you attack speed, which is super useful, and you should abuse the crap out of these champions because they're so good on their own. You don't need to play around them, and if you share a trait with them, like you're just getting free buffs for whoever your carry is. Another example would be like someone who gives crowd control, like Lulu. She just makes their target dance, or like obviously like Swain, but Swain's existed in every set. Those are all going to be support-ish units, but there are a bunch of random units in this set which can buff up your team or specific units, and you definitely need to take advantage of that because they've been limited so much for a reason. My next tip is about checking data. So a lot of people, when they check TFT data, they're always like, oh my god, the average placement's so good, like I must play this. But that's not always going to be true. There's always a lot of bias in data, and I just want to make sure that you understand that. So if we're talking about like items, for example, you might see Lissandra and you're like, oh, Jeweled Gauntlet's 4.09 and it's the most built, but like Spear of Shojin's 4.0. Like, do I even need Jeweled Gauntlet? Like, if you do Spear of Shojin, Void Staff is 3.86, and then oh, look, like Jeweled Gauntlet's not the best item, it's 3.85. Why don't I build Morello at 3.73 or Archangels at 3.75? I tell you, like, that's not the best way to go about this because you absolutely need Jeweled Gauntlet on Lissandra in order to get a lot of damage on her. The reason why the data is skewed is because the games where she does not have Jeweled Gauntlet, people have crit from other effects such as Jeweled Lotus. So if you do have Jeweled Lotus, then yeah, it's better to get like a Rabadon's or an Archangels on your Lissandra, right? But in like 99% of cases, like you absolutely need Jeweled Gauntlet. Like even if the average placement is a bit higher than some of the other items, like the play rate or total games definitely does have an effect there. It's not everyone being sheep and being stupid, right? Well, sometimes that is the case, but more often than not, it's not the case. So be very careful when looking at data. Another data trap is looking at any of the Renekton win rates. Renekton requires you to win a lot of games to even unlock him. So if you're winning rounds in stage 4 and 5, which is when you get Azir, like you're going to be placing high no matter what. So even though Renekton has a very high average placement, and he probably is pretty good, you have to also remember that it assumes that you are able to get Renekton, and that assumes winning a lot of late stage fights, which means you're probably going to top 4 or top 3 anyways. It's not necessarily because Renekton good, it's just because a person playing Renekton is having a good game. Now for a more philosophical tip, and that is you should take breaks when you play TFT. I know that sounds like so generic, blah, blah, blah. And I know many of us don't have jobs or kids to take care of, so we play TFT 6 hours in a row because we have nothing else going on in life. But oddly enough, like doing that, like playing TFT the entire day, isn't even optimal for getting better at TFT. So if you end up doing that and you have like none of the other things I mentioned, like you're just digging an even bigger hole for yourself. So if you don't have anything going for you in life, you could at least be good at TFT. And in order to maximize that, you absolutely need to be taking breaks between games, either to get a mental reset, get some water, get some food, recharge or whatever, but also to maybe even review your previous games. If you're just like playing TFT from morning till night, like you're not gonna get that much better. Like, yeah, you will get better because you're just spamming games and getting more practice, but you also run the risk of building really bad habits that you could have fixed if you reviewed like one game. So make sure you take breaks, and obviously even if you aren't even playing that much, breaks are still fine too, because it gets you thinking about other stuff. Maybe you think about TFT during a walk or something like that. You could think of like new strategies or like new ways to play, or like reflect on something you did in a game before, and that will all make you a better player. So speaking of gaining LP, unironically, using websites like bunnymuffins.lol, hashtag not sponsored, are a great way to quickly improve, because you get to see players who actually do play every day build out ideal setups for the team comps, and it saves you like hours and hours and hours of research time or LP experimentation. So if you want to find out whether, like, I don't know, Freljord is good or not, you could go out and like play Freljord like 10 times and be like, oh, I averaged this, and I thought I played like 7 out of 10 this game, 8 out of 10 that game. So I'm guessing the comp's pretty decent because I averaged like a 4.0 or whatever. Like, if you just look at a guide, you get all that information in like seconds, right? So you don't have to pay the LP cost, because sometimes if you try out a new comp, you suck at it if it's hard. Like Ixtal, for example, if you like play Ixtal for the first time, you probably will get screwed. Or one of the tips I gave before about Shurima, if you just go for 4 Shurima and you don't know when to go for it, you will pay the LP costs, and you could have just saved all that time if you just went to a website. I'm not saying you have to use it, but resources are there if you want to like be super optimal with your time. And then once you learn from the guide, then you can expand on it yourself based on your own experiences. I think that's another important skill that a lot of players lack, is that they focus in on one thing and then they don't deviate from it at all because something said so. And that's also not a good approach either. You gotta realize the nuances, and not everything can be covered in one page. So one way to dive even deeper is to obviously check out data sites like teamfight.lol, use the Explorer tool, get a deeper understanding of what's optimal and what's not, and also try to figure out why, because there are biases in the data, but sometimes there are things that slip and people don't realize is actually good. There are actually a lot of players who discovered OP comps because of that. And then once they started doing it, then it became popular like 1 or 2 patches later. But let's get back to the game now. You should probably, when you're in the intermediate level, get used to positioning every turn. Maybe not every turn, but as many turns as you can. I know I've said in the past, like, oh, you don't need to position and you could get to Challenger by never scouting. That is true, but it's a lot easier if you do position and scout. Like, it's infinitely easier. So it's a good habit to get into, because as you get higher and higher, positioning becomes more and more important, and it's best to get into the habit early on so it doesn't feel tedious later. One simple positioning change can literally save you 10 HP every single fight, because you could avoid a lost fight if your key unit gets stunned or targeted by some random nonsense like Fizz. So every 10 life you save is +1 average placement in the late game, like every fight you win in the late game. If you were supposed to win it and then you magically lost it, like that's just -1 placement. So you could do the opposite and get the +1 placement by doing it to other people. And if you do this over like a pretty big sample size of games, like +1, +1, +1, that's a lot of LP that adds up, because each placement is around 10 to 15 LP. Speaking of positioning, like who do you know who you're gonna face next? Use the sword on the right-hand side to figure out who, because it's just free information that everyone should be using. This is more of a beginner tip. I know it's the intermediate section, but because I was talking about positioning here, that's where I wanted to place it. Now let's talk about portals. So portals are the things that happens at the start of every game, and it kind of makes a game a little bit different every single time. But there are a couple new portals that were introduced in this new set, and I want to cover generic strategies on how to approach them. So first one I want to cover is Silver Scrapes. So Silver Scrapes is not something you ever really plan around. Just play your game as you normally would. The only time I would worry about Silver Scrapes is if you're high rolling so hard that you know you're automatically going to get top 2. in which case maybe you could plan around the 70 gold that you're gonna get later. But that's pretty much the only time I'd actually plan around silver scrapes. If not, I would treat it as if it was like a no portal game. Because if you get third, you don't even experience the portal. So imagine if you get anything worse than that and you're worrying about silver scrapes. Like, never worry about this until you're like super high rolling so hard that you're already guaranteed top 2. Next up is Howling Abyss. This is a new encounter where you get 5 random 1 costs. Not too much action is needed here, but it does mean you get some gold that game, so you do have higher econ. And also, you must be careful of early game board strength because most people will just have stronger boards in stage 2. So if you're used to having like 1 2-star and you're like, oh, I can go like 4 and 1 on stage 2 with this 1 2-star. Like, let's say it's Briar, and Briar's pretty good at that stage, right? That might not happen as often as it normally would because people might have 2 2-stars or even 3 2-stars because they got all these 1-cost units. So if you are trying to win streak, you need to have advantages from different aspects of the game apart from unit upgrades because everyone will have unit upgrades in Howling Abyss. So you need to have like a good item augment, you might need to have like a good trait activated, or maybe a good synergy between your units. Those are going to be the deciding factors on who wins streaks and who doesn't, not just upgrades. Next we have is Emblem Ensemble. This one's really fun. I love this change personally, but it's replacing Wandering Trainers and Golems. I absolutely hated those in previous sets. I probably will still hate Emblem Ensemble, but it's a lot better. The reason why is because for Prismatics, it makes it a lot harder to hit because you need level 10. Before you could get to 10 traits without even needing to be level 10, you could be level 9, which made the spike a lot earlier, and someone who got lucky would just auto-win. And also, unlike your wife, you're not actually married to the emblems that you get in Emblem Ensemble because you can reforge them if you really want to. Whereas when they were on trainer golems or training dummies, you could not reforge them at all and you're stuck with them the rest of the game even if they sucked. So I personally really like this change, even though I'm probably still going to hate this portal. And also Rise is going to be really good on this portal if you get regions. But last but not least, it also adds more skill expression to the game because you need to know who uses emblems the best. And what is the best way to do that? Well, head on over to teamfight.lol, go to the Explorer, type in whichever emblem that you want, and it'll tell you who the very good holders are, either by popularity or average placement, both of which are very strong metrics. The last portal I want to talk about is Teemo. So Teemo gives 1 more augment reroll for all augments. I'm not the biggest fan of this portal because it's really just a knowledge check for players. So whoever knows which augments are best in slot for their particular comp just get like a pretty big advantage here. So it's kind of like a memorization test. Like if you read the dictionary, you're gonna do better on the SATs, right? But not everyone's got the time to do that. So I'm not the biggest fan of this portal for that reason, but it is fun to reroll augments. You don't get screwed ever. But another thing to keep in mind with this portal is that comps that rely on specific augments become a lot better. So if you really need an artifact item, it's going to be easier to get those. So for example, if you're playing Void, you may know that the augment win out is really, really good because you get to go to level 10 by just simply reaching level 9, and that helps you unlock Baron Nashor a lot earlier. Those types of comps are going to be a lot better in this portal. Speaking of augments, I want to cover 6 little augment tips. Some of them are general, some of them are specific, but my first tip for augments is to figure out which augments are best for which types of comps. So there are some generic sounding augments that aren't actually generic. For example, Warlord's Honor may look like it just gives generic stats, but the caveat is that you need to stack it every round. So what that means is that this favors reroll and vertical comps a lot more than it does flex comps because you need to play those units early in order to get them stacking early. If you just played this as like a flex board and you pivot a lot of times, like you're not gonna get a lot of power from this augment, even though it seems like a generic one because it just gives a bunch of stats. The next augment tip is that they removed all crest and crown augments, the ones where you get emblems, so don't fish for these and don't play around them. More on that is that augments that do give emblems are now randomized emblems. Only take these if your boards are flexible and if you are comfortable pivoting if needed. Next, I want to talk about not pre-leveling in stage 4-1 because this set, they added the augment called Growth Mindset, which potentially appears on stage 4-2, which is essentially like level up. Back in previous sets, no one ever pre-leveled before 4-2 because of the off chance they get level up, but then they removed level up from appearing in stage 4-2, and then everyone just started pre-leveling again. But they added this little mechanic back in through this augment, and so you have to be careful of pre-leveling a lot right before stage 4 too. Like, only do it if you know for sure you do not want growth mindset. Next up we have is Advanced Loan. This is a weird augment. It gives you a lot of gold now, but obviously it downgrades your next augment. It's really good if the next augment is a gold augment, because then you get a silver one. But if it's a prismatic one, everyone gets a prismatic and you're stuck with a gold, and that's like a huge power difference. So if you somehow know that the next augment is prismatic, maybe you have, I think it's the Zillion Galaxy or the Bard Galaxy is the one where the last augment is prismatic. If you ever see that one and you get offered Advanced Loan on stage 3, do not take it, because you know for sure that the next one's going to be prismatic. On the flip side, if you know the next one's going to be gold, then Advanced Loan is going to be very good because you don't lose out on that much power. The next augment tip I have is that you need to play to your augment strength. Focus Fire, for example, gives your team attack damage and even more every 5 seconds. If you have this augment and you open up an item anvil and you have the options of Deathblade, Rageblade, and Warmogs, what do you pick? Well, for one, it's probably not Deathblade because you already get a lot of attack damage from your augment. I'm not saying Deathblade is completely horrible, because it does give other stats, such as damage amplification, but Rageblade might be a bit better if you want to focus on getting more damage, because if you have a lot of attack damage, you probably want a lot of attack speed, and that's exactly what Rageblade gives. Something else to consider might be the Warmogs that popped up too. Warmogs helps your tanks live longer, and thus it should allow you to stack this augment a bit longer during the fight. Maybe you need to finish itemizing your primary tank, maybe Hire has 3 items, and then you could even put it on a secondary tank. The longer your front line lives, the more time your augment has to stack, which leads to even more gained attack damage from Focused Fire. Let's finish off the video with 5 advanced tips, and the first one is about flex play. There are a lot of late game counter +1 techs that you can play, and you kind of need to be aware of all of them. So make sure you scout your opponents in 1v1 situations to figure out which champions bonuses would help you most in the next fight. For example, Shyvana is pretty good if they do a lot of ability damage because she reduces ability damage. Obviously, Taric and Skarner are good for armor and MR depending on what you need, but there's so many different champions that have these weird little counter effects that can be essentially devastating to your opponents if you do have that space for that +1. So if you're in a 1v1, figure out what they have and build the best counter board to them. There's a lot of thinking on the fly this set. The next tip I have is related, and that is you absolutely need to be adaptive this set. Do not fixate on comps from the start as hard as you did in previous sets. I'm not saying never do this, because obviously you still can fixate on comps, but you're going to be doing it a little bit less than you usually would in the past. Now I want to talk about being contested. So being contested isn't going to be as bad this set because there are fewer reroll comps compared to before, but how do you know when to pivot, and how do you know when to stick with it and just suck it up? So this is a difficult yet easy question to answer. And there are some comps that are uncontestable, meaning that only one person can go them every single game. These are mainly reroll comps, but the best way to decide for you whether you should stay or pivot is by judging who has a better opener for that comp. The person that has the better opener is the only one that's allowed to play it. If you have a weaker opener, the person with a weaker opener will just bleed out in the early game and will not be able to stabilize with a 3-star early enough that game, and then they're probably just going to go 7th or 8th. Whereas the person with a strong opener, maybe like they got the perfect artifact item for the reroll comp, they're still going to be able to be semi-stable throughout most of the game and maybe even win streak in the early game because of that, and they just have to wait for the other person to die. Even if the other person does hit the 3-star before them, the person with the better opener is still going to have an okay game. For 4 and 5 costs, it gets a little trickier. Generally, these can always be shared by at least 2 players, but anything more than that, you need to have a pretty good reason to go into it, whether it's like an augment that really helps you out for that comp, or maybe it's a specific item that you have that kind of locks you into that build. Or maybe you just naturaled all the units so you don't need to care whether you're contested or not. But generally for 4 costs, just go for it, unless literally like 5 people are playing the same comp. For vertical comps, it's a bit easier. If someone has an emblem and you don't, generally do not contest it ever unless you have a super specific reason to do so. And if you have an emblem and someone's still going to your comp, like you can't pivot, it's too late, you just have to go for it. Now let's talk about knowing when to do things. So know when to go for 1st, 4th, 6th, or any placement, because whenever I watch high level players play, like the super high level ones, you may notice that they rarely ever go 8th when they're playing on ladder. This is because they recognize bad spots and ensure they do everything in their power to avoid going 8th in those situations. And as we talked about before, each placement really does matter, even if it doesn't seem like it does. The difference between a 6th or 7th compared to an 8th, if you do that many times over the course of a set, it really does add up. On the flip side, You need to know when you need to go for first place. If you get a high roll game, you have to take advantage of it. It's like getting pocket aces in poker. Like, if you get that hand, you have to make use of it. I'm not saying it's an auto win because it's not, but if you do get good luck, you do need to try to exploit it. So if you were super high rolling and you got second, that's pretty much like a waste of a high roll game. You're not gonna get those every time. So when you do get them, make sure you do everything in your power to guarantee the first. The same rule applies to every other placement. Based on your luck, you might be guided towards a certain placement every game in the early game, but if you don't play to that, you might end up getting something worse because you got greedy, or maybe you underestimated yourself. But essentially, if you assume that every one extra placement is 10 to 15 LP, if you do that 25 to 40 times over the course of a set, that's the difference between a whole tier in ranking, for example, gold to platinum. The 67th and last tip for you today is about making gains in TFT. You know the saying, abs are made in the kitchen? Well, in TFT, gains are made in the VOD review. I know it doesn't sound as catchy, but reviewing your games, either your own or other people's, is the singular best way to get better at TFT because you have unlimited time to play out your turns and you could really figure out what the best play in each situation is. Being able to pause and play replays is such a powerful effect, and if you're reviewing your own games with other people, you could get other people's inputs on potentially different directions that you could have tried, or just other considerations that you didn't really think about, or just simply learning more about that specific comp you went for. Maybe there's some tips and tricks that other people have for you. But doing these types of reviews will make it much easier to play more accurately in future games because you'll know exactly what you need to do without needing to think, which means that you could use your thinking power in-game for other decisions such as positioning, planning future turns, or anything else. Out of all these tips, let me know which ones were your favorites, but that is all I have for you today. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did not learn anything new at all, rewatch the video in 0.75 speed and let me know if it still happened. But if you did learn a bunch, I would appreciate it if you checked out bunnymuffins.lol/meta for TFT tier list, and then teamfight.lol for data checking and also profile checking. But that's gonna be it for me today. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I'll see you all next time.